Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Empowered to Advocate podcast. This is Dana Marie. I'm here with Michelle, and today we're going to talk about LRE, Least Restrictive Environment. This is something that has come up in meetings lately for us and in conversations with parents and caregivers. And while we've given you a little bit of information on Instagram and other platforms, we thought we would dive a little bit deeper today to talk about what it actually means and what it means for you and your child as you navigate the special education process. So with that, I'm going to throw it to Michelle, who's going to get us started with a simple explanation of what least restrictive environment actually means.
So most simply, least restrictive environment means having students who have disabilities receiving their supports and their education in an environment with non-disabled peers. That's the most simple. So under IDEA, we are looking to have students with disabilities being educated with students without disabilities as much as possible. And the only time a student should be separated from in like a smaller group or a sub-separate, and we'll talk about the continuum that we would follow when talking about least restrictive environment, is if they really can't be supported to access the content in that inclusive environment. So this really comes from, and depending on how old you are and when you're listening, if you think about how much access you saw to students with disabilities when you were in school and where those students maybe were educated, and now think about how schools are set up now, you are much more likely to see students, and of course, not all disabilities are visible, right? But you are more likely to observe students with a variety of disabilities. Either you might see students walking with their AAC iPad, right? You might see students in a wheelchair. You might see students with walking canes if they're visually impaired in a regular elementary school or at the neighborhood high school, right? This is a big change actually from where we were before, because all of the research shows that students learn best when they have access to the same rigorous content and when they have models of peers who are their age having age, quote unquote, appropriate conversations, interactions with one another. And it's really helpful for every student to be in an inclusive environment. It is also very beneficial for students without disabilities to be in classrooms with students with disabilities because everybody's learning from one another about their own unique learning needs.
And I think you bring up a good point before we get into the continuum of like what this could actually look like. When we're talking about educating students in a least restrictive environment or the least restrictive environment, we're talking about so much more than academic instruction. We surely are talking about academic instruction in the content areas and reading and writing and math and social studies and science in specials as well. But we're talking about educating the whole child as well. So Michelle mentioned communication, making sure that students with communication disabilities have access to their same age peers for conversation, for appropriate play, for practicing those like appropriate turn-taking skills and so on and so forth. We're talking about in the lunchroom, on the playground, in gym, in classes outside of academics. We're talking about even students who have, significant social emotional challenges and or behavioral challenges, making sure, like Michelle said, they're in an environment when appropriate, where they have other peers, other non-disabled peers, who they're able to model or who they're able to interact with, and not just, as Michelle said, being in a restrictive classroom, school, where they might not have access to their peers. When we talk about all of that, the one thing that I think we sometimes leave out is community, and that's really important to us, building a sense of community for your child. You have your home as a parent or caregiver where you've built a community for your child. But then when they go out into the neighborhood, into the school with their friends, like I said, on the playground, at the grocery store, they're building and you're helping them build their community. And a great way to do that, especially if you have a child with a disability, is to make sure that they are included in as many ways as possible throughout their school day and outside of their school day with their peers. It's a way for them to build their own community, but when they're younger, have you kind of help support them do that. So I'm going to pass it back to Michelle because I do want to talk about how we actually do this, because I think that part can feel confusing and tricky to parents and to caregivers, and honestly, sometimes to educators. Okay, if a student is struggling, if a student is not doing well in their current placement, in their classroom, so on and so forth, what does it actually look like to make decisions for that student without automatically going to a setting, a placement, an environment that is more restrictive?
So I think it's important I think it's now the best time to mention what the continuum would look like, because we are looking to provide as much instruction as possible in the inclusive environment. So this would be a regular general education classroom with a mix of students with IEPs and without IEPs. Okay. And we have full inclusion, and then we have what's called partial inclusion, which a certain amount, and even with a full inclusion placement, you could still have some services outside of the general education classroom. So your child might receive specialized reading instruction each day for 30 minutes outside of the general education classroom, either one-on-one or in a small group. That would still be considered a full inclusion placement because most of the instruction is happening in inclusion. Now, if your child has a certain amount, a certain percentage of those smaller group learning opportunities outside of the general education classroom. So if they have reading instruction and 2 times a week speech and 2 times a week OT and an academic support kind of block, and that percentage or amount of time in the smaller group without students without disabilities, that might look like a partial inclusion environment. Okay. So part of their schooling is in the inclusive environment, part of it is outside. Then we move to substantially separate. And this is when it's a more specialized program and the majority of the child's day is spent in a smaller group specialized setting. So this might look like a therapeutic setting. This classroom is still going to be in the district, in a elementary, middle, or high school or early learning center. So they are still part of the school community wide, and they then might push in for some inclusion opportunities. So exploratories or lunchtime, recess, whatever is deemed the best opportunity for them to have. So it's kind of the opposite of full inclusion, right? And then from there, that's when we start looking at public day schools, which would be collaboratives. So they're usually linked in with the school district. School districts usually belong to a collaborative. And there are many times when some students require going out of district. It's a school, it's out of the district, it's more specialized programming for whatever the student's needs are. Sometimes, many times, in my experience, students have gone out of district and then actually been able to come back in to district and maybe one of those a therapeutic program or an ABA-based program, right? Because that's always our goal, is to work students towards that more inclusive environment eventually. So outside, so sub-separate, and then out of district schools. And I think we can, just for the purpose of today, kind of clump those together. And then maybe, if somebody listening is interested, we can kind of talk about like the different types of out of district placements, but that's essentially the continuum of what we're going for. And I think your other question, Dana Marie, was that How are we deciding what placement a student is going into? And really what is driving the placement is what services a student needs in order to be successful. Because remember, we're talking about how much time a student is spending outside of the general education curriculum, classroom. So we're looking at that. We need to know what services they need. What amount of services they need is determined by the team conversation on their current performance levels.
Yeah.
Turn it back over to you.
Yeah, I think that something that just came up that I think is really important too is all of these conversations are team conversations, and they are team decisions, including you, the parent or caregiver. So if your child's school is thinking that they may require more time outside of an inclusive setting, or they might even require a substantially separate placement, like Michelle said, and or an out-of-district placement, those conversations should not be just happening within the school, and then the school's calling you or emailing you or sending a letter and saying, we made this decision. Those are conversations that need to happen with you as a part of the team, so that you can have input, obviously, as well into that conversation. You know, one thing that Michelle brought up is current performance level, and that's another thing we want to talk a little bit about today. When we look at the best setting to educate a student in, to educate a child in, including what services they need, we go by what their current level of performance is. And so what we mean by that is we don't go by what they were doing a year ago. We don't go by what we think might happen in 6 months from now if, you know, X, Y, and Z happens or doesn't happen. We go by what are they able to do right now in the setting that they're in, and are we able to service them in this setting? And so one thing that I think is really, really important is when those conversations do come up, whether the school team brings them up or you as a parent or caregiver bring them up about maybe needing a different placement, a different setting for your child, the question we always like to ask first is there anything else we can do in this more inclusive setting to help support the child, the student? And that can look like, Michelle said, increasing services in any number of different areas. That can mean going back and looking at accommodations and seeing if the accommodations are actually supporting the student. It could look at maybe getting more information. A lot of times it looks like we don't actually know what's going on here. We need more information. So it could be doing updated assessments and evaluations, or taking a closer look at one specific area to get more information to help inform the decision. So these decisions should never be made abruptly. They should not be made sort of haphazardly. They should really be based, like we said, in that current performance, but also after having a full conversation, if not many conversations, about what else could we possibly be doing for this student in order to help them remain in the most inclusive environment that works for them. For every single student, that is not a full inclusion program, like we said earlier. For every single student, that's not a substantially separate program, right? It really is super individualized, but making sure you have that conversation about if things could be changed, if things could be adapted, if, you know, a period of time is necessary to take a deeper look, take more data, come back to the table in 4 weeks or in 6 weeks or in 8 weeks. We have found that oftentimes that really can help inform a conversation. If we say, listen, we've got to dig a little deeper on these 3 items. We want to do a couple of assessments. We want to take a look at the student, maybe in a different classroom or in a different setting, and then come back to the table and share with the team what we found, what we know, how that can help inform the decision. I think that sometimes that piece gets lost. And I think there are a couple different reasons why that piece gets lost, but this should really, really, really be a back and forth conversation about what is best for the child and how we're going to help the child stay in the most inclusive setting as humanly possible. for them. And so making sure that we're not making those sort of rash decisions and taking a look at all the information and all the data that we could possibly get.
Yeah, I think, it's also important to note that the conversation about placement, so when we're talking about a full inclusion placement, a separate placement, that should be happening every time you develop an IEP. So at least annually, or if you come back to the team to discuss, so maybe your child is making really excellent progress and they're in a separate classroom right now, the team might come back together and have a conversation about making their IEP a little less restrictive and having more inclusion opportunities. This might then change their IEP actually from a separate to a partial inclusion. You usually do it nice and slow like that. You want to go step by step on the continuum. Obviously, sometimes for some students, that's absolutely not possible. We see this a lot for kids who have difficulty regulating their emotions and their behaviors in a way that is safe for themselves and other students and staff, that sometimes this process moves on the continuum a little bit faster because we really need to make sure that that student is safe, as well as their peers and as well as the staff. And that oftentimes, depending on the behaviors, even with an FBA giving a BCBA giving a behavior plan, even if that behavior plan is being followed with fidelity, right? Even if that student is so dysregulated that it's unsafe, this could call for moving quicker on that continuum for them to be in a program that's more specialized to support them to learn those skills and strategies to help them regulate so that they can keep themselves and others safe, right? But again, even in those cases, you're still having the conversation ongoing about if they still need that level of support, because sometimes kids can be very dysregulated. And then after a couple of months of that really intensive programming, might be ready for something least restrictive. And that's why it's all individualized and should always be a conversation.
And one thing that we are not going to have enough time to get into today, I briefly mentioned it and Michelle kind of alluded to it as well, but there are systems in place that help school teams and parents and caregivers sort of try on different models, different settings for size, right? And so I think since every child is individual, it's kind of difficult and really impossible to predict and know exactly how that child is going to do in a specific setting, right? And so there are ways and there are systems in place to help the teams make decision, including you as the parent or caregiver. So that can look like going out for an assessment for a month and a half and coming back to their placement. It can look like trying out a placement in that way and getting more information, right? And doing more assessments in that new setting, new evaluations in that new setting to get more information. But if you have specific questions of that, definitely do reach out to us, because those conversations are a little bit more specific to individual students. But there are systems in place that can help parents understand a little bit better too the different settings and the different placements that maybe a school team is proposing for their child, including going to observe them, going to take a look and see what it looks like and feels like, and so on and so forth. So if that's you and you're sort of in the midst of these conversations with school, or maybe starting this conversation with school, definitely do reach out to us, because those can be, like I said, a little bit more specific conversations and too much to get into today. But just know that there are systems in place that do not necessarily mean that you have to sit at a meeting and agree to a different placement or a more restrictive placement, or, make a decision in a day or 2 days. There are other steps that should and can be taken to make sure that you also have all of the information that you need to make that decision.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to note that, again, when we talk about this a lot in all of our episodes, is always coming to the table believing that everybody around the table has the best intentions for the student. So sometimes it can be very shocking for caregivers to hear that a school district is proposing something more restrictive. And likewise, sometimes caregivers, it can be very shocking that the school district is proposing something more inclusive. So sometimes if your child is and has been in either an out-of-district school or a sub-separate placement, and it's been a long time, and that's all you or your child knows, based on the data, they might be doing really excellent, and the school district might be saying it's time to move them back in district, or it's time to move them into a partial inclusion, like we want to try this out. And that can also feel really scary, especially because if that's the place where your child has felt comfortable, has been having success, any sort of change can be scary because it's unknown, right? And that's why it's so important that you are involved in every part of the conversation. But I do think it's important to listen to all sides of the story of what the data, and for caregivers to say, I need the data to show why you are proposing this, right? And then being able to look at that data, understand what that data is saying, and then be able to ask your questions from there. What would this different placement look like? What supports are there? What happens if they're not successful there? What are the opportunities for them to be part of a school culture if we're proposing more restrictive, right? So there's a lot of pieces that can go into this, but like Dana Marie just said, you do not have to sign anything at that meeting. I actually would recommend that you do not sign anything right at that meeting, unless perhaps they are recommending what Dana Marie was just talking about, an extended evaluation in an assessment center where it's 40 days, the team there collects information, and then the placement where your child is currently at is what is their stay put. At the end of that evaluation, that team is going to help their current team make recommendations either for the placement your child's currently in or for a different placement. And I think it's really important that if you do an extended eval, knowing that what is proposed on the other side of that evaluation may not be what they're currently getting. Mm-hmm. Like that extended eval, that assessment time is not like a magic wand where for whatever reason, if it's behavior or regulation or communication, those 40 days are going to go by real fast. And the purpose of that is to help determine what supports the child needs, not to necessarily help get them regulated, right? So knowing that that's what's going to be on the other side of that, and it may not be the current placement that they're currently in. So if you do have that proposed for your child, going into it as those could be the recommendations, right? It's not kind of a Band-Aid situation.
And like
it shouldn't be.
No, it should not be. And like we said, that is definitely a more individualized conversation, definitely a longer conversation than today, because each case is certainly very, very different.
For sure.
So I think we'd like to leave you with sort of one thing that you can do right away that will help to inform if you're someone listening on the other end thinking, is this me? Is this my child? Are they making progress in their current placement? Is this really the right setting for them? Is it too restrictive? Is it not restrictive enough? One sort of thing that you can do to start is to look at their progress. We talked a lot today about current performance and current progress. Look at their progress reports. Look at last year's IEP matched up against this year's IEP. Have the goals changed? Have they gotten more challenging? Have you noticed that your child has seemed to be working on the same goals for the last 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, maybe even more? Have you noticed that, in fact, the school team has made the goals less challenging, maybe since last year or the year before? All of those certainly do not say right off the bat, this child needs a different setting, but they might help you to ask some questions about if things need to be changed. if things need to be accommodated differently, if services need to be increased, decreased, whatever the case may be. So really, when those progress reports come, or when that new IEP comes, asking yourself that question: what is their progress? Have I seen it from last year to this year in all areas that they have goals? And do I have concerns about that? Do I have questions? Because that's a kind of a small thing that you can do to start a larger conversation about what your child might need that they might not be getting. And so one thing that we always recommend to parents, especially when we're heading into IEP meetings or preparing for IEP meetings, is to just take another peek at those progress reports to see what progress their child is making or not making towards their goals, because that can really help inform the conversation and really help inform decision making for the next year and beyond. So that's your one takeaway today. That's your sort of one thing that you can do right away, is to start there and just start looking and asking questions. You might not know all the answers, but you can at least start asking those questions.
Yeah, I think it's always a great question is, can I see the data? And some school staff are better at collecting data than others, to be honest, because all human beings have different skill sets. But your child deserves, especially if the team is proposing a different setting, especially if they're proposing a more restrictive setting, your child and you deserve to be able to see the actual numbers, the actual data, not just he's had 5 bad days or she's not made any progress. Show me the data. Mm-hmm. Show me the data. And they should be able to show that to you. And if they cannot show that to you, then fair enough for you to be able to say, I need more data on this in order to be able to make an informed decision about where my child is going to be learning.
Absolutely. And that's something you can be doing actually all the time, whether it's about setting or about somewhere else. That is actually, or something else. That's something that you can be doing all the time. We are out of time today. Thank you so much for listening. This was a really quick overview of a really important and really complex topic in special education. So if you do have questions, please reach out to us. If you have a specific question about your child, go on our website and schedule a free 20-minute consult to get started and see if there's ways that we can help you navigate this process.
All right. Till next time, everybody.